So as a first speaker, I would like to introduce Dr. Gregory Jaczko. For him, it's very early in the morning in Washington, and we are very much grateful that you are joining us here today. Dr. Jaczko is a physicist. Among other things, he was adjunct professor for physics and public policy at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He served for many years on the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC. He was chairman of that organization from 2009 to 2012. And Dr. Jaczko will speak on situation of aging nuclear power plants in the US. You have the word, Dr. Jaczko.
Well, thank you, Wolfgang, and thank you to INRAG for, and of course the government of Baden-Württemberg for putting on this conference, because I think this is a very, very important topic. I have slides, of course, and so I will switch my screen into that mode to go through my presentation. And I want to say it is nice to see many of you here on the Zoom, and I know it's been a long time since any of us have, or certainly I have seen many of you in person, and it's really nice to be able to do this via the Zoom. So I will talk today about the situation with the aging of nuclear power plants in the United States, and what I think is really the fundamental reason driving this. And, it's interesting is in the time that the INRAG report was prepared, many things have actually happened in the United States, including the approval for second life extensions for nuclear power plants, which I think certainly is probably the one of the only times that that's been done so far in any country. So it is certainly become an issue here in this country, but it's not one that gets a tremendous amount of attention. And I will talk about in my talk basically 3 points. The first is really what I think is the reason behind license renewal, and really what the focus and motivation is for license renewal or life extension for nuclear power plants in the United States. I'll then talk a little bit in some detail about the actual process and the way that what is called the initial license renewal has worked. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about what's so-called subsequent license renewal, which previously was called Life Beyond 60, but it refers to granting of a second license extension. As I said, something that has happened already here in the United States. And when I was chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, this was beginning to be an issue. Nuclear power plants were talking about their interest in seeking a second license extension for nuclear reactors. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, but at that time there was, I think, there was a degree of skepticism within the technical staff of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission about how that process should be done, and how it was in fact different really from this initial license extension. So I'll talk about all of those things and some of the issues behind that. To do that, I think it's important to set a scene for what the nuclear reactor fleet looks like in the United States. And the most important issue really for this conference and for this discussion are some of these points that I've put here on the slide. Number one, the United States licenses nuclear reactors very differently from other countries in the world. The US law that governs the licensing and the regulation of nuclear power plants essentially allows that a nuclear power plant is licensed for 40 years initially. And by law, then, nuclear reactors are entitled to seek an extension of that license for 20 years. And there's no set limit on how many times that extension can happen, and how many years a plant can ultimately be allowed to operate. Of course, there are safety and technical reasons, which is largely left to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to determine how that process should work. So the law that governs the licensing and the license extension is very specific, but very limited in what a license extension means. And it simply says that plants can seek an extension of that license for 20 years with no limitation on how many times you can do that. Now, if you look at nuclear power plants in the United States, the average age of nuclear reactors is 39 years. So most plants today in the United States are either about to enter or have entered that period of second or first 20-year operation. So most plants are operating post 40 years of operation. So the fleet is aging, and in fact, the fleet is shrinking. So from a peak in 2012, when I chaired the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, there were 104 operating nuclear reactors. Today, there are 94 in the US, and further retirements are expected in the next several years. And I'll show you a chart in just a few minutes to talk about that. One thing that's interesting is while the absolute number of reactors has gone down, the US has largely maintained about the same amount of energy from nuclear power in that period, say from 2012 until today. And that's largely because of efforts to increase power at existing reactors. So while you have reactors that are aging, at the same time, you also have reactors that are operating with less margin than they were originally licensed to. And that's essentially how these power upgrades have occurred. So again, looking at just the status of existing reactors, there really are two fundamental issues that have driven this change and the reduction in the number of reactors from 2012. There are safety problems that have led to the closure of reactors, and then there are economic factors that have led to the closure of reactors. So for instance, the San Onofre reactors, which are two pressurized water reactors in the state of California, they closed in 2013 because of the failure of steam generators that were built to replace the existing steam generators at the reactor, and the new steam generators failed essentially upon installation, causing a small radiation release to the environment, and they were never able to provide a meaningful plan to replace those steam generators, and the plant shut down. Similarly, a plant in Crystal River shut down because of problems with the containment structure, again related to major equipment replacements. And then finally, Fort Calhoun shut down after a period of troubled operation, and ultimately deciding that the cost of operation was no longer competitive with other sources. The remaining shutdowns really stemmed from this economic factor that's driving much of the electricity policy in the United States. Here in the US, as I said, since most nuclear reactors are at least 30, 35 years old, the cost basis for nuclear reactors is driven almost exclusively by operations and maintenance. And so to put that in perspective, in 2019, which is where the most recent numbers are that I have, the O&M costs are about $30 a megawatt hour for nuclear power plant operation. New solar and wind on average are about 30, 31 dollars a megawatt hour for generation, and that is for new facilities, and that is without any type of subsidy. New solar, in fact, with subsidies is less than that price, and combined cycle gas, which certainly from a climate perspective is not the correct solution, but nonetheless from an economic perspective is also very, very competitive with existing nuclear reactor operations. So it is those facts that really are putting the pressure on the nuclear industry and certainly the institutions that govern the nuclear operation in the U.S. To try and find ways to keep nuclear competitive. Just to give you a reference, this is a slide that I use often in discussions about nuclear power. It is from Lazard's, which is a financial analysis firm, and it shows you here. If you look, you can see on the left, this is essentially the so-called levelized cost of new build for wind and solar, and you can see for onshore wind, you're looking at anything from $9 a megawatt hour, which is extremely low for subsidized onshore wind, all the way to 43. Solar, you see here in this range of anywhere from 24 to 30 to, or 29 to 38. And again, for the unsubsidized wind, you're looking at anywhere from 26 to 54. Most of those subsidies for those resources are expected to decline. Over here on the right, you see the competition, which is just the marginal cost for selected generators. So if you look at nuclear, you see here in this bar on, and I guess you may not be able to see on the right hand block, the bar in the middle is essentially the marginal operating costs for nuclear. And as you can see quite clearly, new generation, in particular from renewables, is cost competitive with existing. I'm sorry, I have a visitor here. I have a cat who's come to join. It's cost competitive with these new existing nuclear is cost competitive with new build for wind and solar, which of course long term will wind up then being cheaper, and we're continuing to see price declines in those technologies. So again, what does this have to do with license renewal? Well, there's really only two ways to maintain nuclear power plant operation in the United States. You can have new reactors, or you can keep the ones that are already there going. And new reactor builds in the United States is also a very troubled process. So in the early 2010s, so really peaking in 2010, 2011, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission had 18 applications for 30 new reactors. Now, most of those plants were never pursued. In fact, only 4 of them were ever licensed and then initiated construction. And that was in 2012. Those were 2 plants at the VC Summer site in South Carolina. Those plants were canceled in 2017. And then 2 plants at the Vogtle site in Georgia. Those are still under construction. They're over budget by approximately $15 billion, which is essentially twice the initial cost, and they're more than 5 years behind schedule. And right now they are planned to begin operations in 2021, the first unit, the second unit in 2022, although it looks like that even will slip into 2022. So the prospects for new build in the United States are essentially non-existent, especially when it comes to large light water reactors, similar to what we have largely dominating the fleet in the US. There are some advanced reactors under consideration, but they simply aren't price competitive with again, these new renewables and natural gas. And so they are more topics for discussion and not so much for actual operation. So what does that make the US nuclear fleet look like? Well, if you look here at this particular chart, this is probably one of the most interesting charts that will factor into almost everything that I'll talk about today. You see 3 lines here. One is the red line. That red line represents what the fleet of nuclear reactors would look like if there had never been any license extensions in the United States. As I said, the initial fleet was licensed for 40 years of operation. And if we had never licensed plants, basically within the next 10 years, the US fleet of reactors would essentially be coming to completion and ending. And I'll talk about it, but the first round of license extension, the regulations were adopted in the mid 1990s. They essentially made it easy for nuclear power plants to receive that first 20-year license extension. And essentially, if you look at this green following into the blue line, that represents what the fleet of reactors would look like if if we had just one license extension. You'll notice that the green line then levels off in about 2028. That's a result of reactors that, while they have been licensed for an additional 20 years, have already announced plans to close. So at best, you're looking at following this green line and then the blue line for the first license extension. The green line represents what would happen if all plants were to receive a second license extension. And I'll talk about the status of that at the end of my discussion. So as you can see, absent any type of license extension in the US, there really would no longer be a nuclear industry in really about 9 to 10 years in this country. And so license extension really has always been about preserving the fleet of nuclear reactors more than it has been about ensuring that nuclear reactors operate with up-to-date safety standards and ensuring the safe operation. It has been something where we have seen from the mid-90s when license renewal was first proposed, so the regulations that would live up to and implement the law that allowed this continued operation, this has been almost exclusively about ensuring that we have continued operation for reactors. So what did that first effort look like? Well, in 1995, the NRC adopted a new regulation to cover these license extensions. And it essentially was based upon two basic principles: that the existing regulations and processes are sufficient to maintain safety, except for new phenomena related to the aging of passive systems. So, you can think piping systems, electrical cabling, containment structures, and that the plants must continue to update what's called the current licensing basis, which you can think of essentially as all the requirements and the changes in requirements that form the basis for the operation of the plant. That new process also required an updated environmental impact assessment, but that is primarily accomplished through a generic environmental review that is applicable to almost all facilities. I think it's important to state that this is not a de novo review of the safety of the facility, and standard rules about backfitting would apply to any updated standards or changes that would need to be implemented. So it's very much a system that relies on the assumption that everything we know about nuclear power plants is sufficient to deal with problems or to identify problems that could occur with aging-related phenomenon before they could cause a significant safety issue. So there are a few very unique aspects of this process that I think call into question many of those assumptions. One of the first and one of the really unique aspects of license renewal is that power plant operators were entitled to seek a license extension up to 20 years before the termination of their first license. So for existing reactors, which were licensed originally for 40 years, that means you'd have at least 20 years of operating experience to determine some information about the operation of that plant prior to going into this period of 20 years of license extension. However, that's not an extensive period of time to learn about aging phenomena that are anticipated to begin to occur certainly beyond 40 years. And if you look at the history of nuclear power plants in the United States, there are many, many issues, materials issues in particular, that have occurred before 40 years of operation, in which materials did not operate to their design specifications and had to have significant replacements. Of course, in the US and of course worldwide, one of the biggest issues has been the failure of steam generators to operate for the expected lifetime of the reactors. And most pressurized water reactors in the US have seen replacements of the steam generators. And as I talked about, 2 plants in the United States were shut down as a result of problems doing steam generator replacements. The San Onofre site, where the generators themselves the new generators were actually deficient, and Crystal River, which was actually unable to restart after a steam generator replacement because the containment structure could not be essentially put back together again. And so there's certainly much evidence about challenges and problems to many different systems, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more, at nuclear reactors just within that 20 to 30 years of operation. So there certainly will be more issues as we get beyond 40 years, and certainly as we get beyond 60 years. The license renewal process, because it is not really a de novo safety review, is relatively straightforward and only takes about 18 months to complete, and has become almost a cookie cutter operation in the United States for nuclear reactors. And again, a unique feature of this process is that plants that are operating, if they file for what's referred to as timely renewal, meaning they put in their license renewal request within 5 years of termination of their license, even if the NRC has not completed its review, and largely that's because of contested legal proceedings or other matters, then the plants are entitled to operate beyond 40 years without any changes to their licensing. And there, in fact, were 2 reactors that did undergo that timely renewal and operated without any significant modifications to their license. So again, this is just to reinforce that the process is focused on ensuring the plants continue to operate rather than identifying, resolving, and updating safety standards for the reactors. So as I said, the key focus for reactor licensing in the United States is really about identifying programs, and not necessarily identifying safety, but identifying programs that will ensure or attempt to ensure that the aging of systems can be properly managed and maintained, so that new issues that will come up with aging systems can be identified in sufficient time to prevent any significant safety problems from occurring. So that's referred to in the NRC's discussion as the aging management reviews. And as I said, this is really the key element of what a license renewal application looks like. Is an applicant has to identify the programs, so the systems, structures, and components that will be subject to aging. And again, this is limited really just to passive systems based on the regulations and the requirements. And so the applicant has to identify those systems that will be brought into their aging management program. It does not necessarily have to evaluate the safety of those systems, but it simply has to demonstrate that a sufficient program will be in place to monitor those systems for the effects of aging. Now, of course, many of those phenomena are today unknown. And so as issues are identified, then they are added to those programs as they come up. And as I said, this really does not refer to active components. And this is one of the areas, say in the mid-90s, when the NRC was looking at a new license renewal program, where the program was scaled back because of pressure from the Congress and the industry. And the argument was that active components which undergo regular maintenance programs, problems with those systems would be identified, and replacements and component upgrades would happen. So those systems don't need to be integrated into the aging management programs. So that is really the basis of how this works. And so what each plant must do as part of this renewal process is analyze the impacts of aging beyond the original 40 years of their design life. And that involves essentially 2 things: an update of that analysis to show that a system will not encounter any aging related phenomenon, or that those aging impacts will have to be put into a program that would then monitor for the safe operation. And as I said, that's the basis for this license renewal review. And a key component of this is something that was referred to as the generic aging lessons learned report, and something called the GAL. And this report essentially catalogs the aging issues that are identified at each reactor, and then any subsequent reactor incorporates that into their license renewal program and reviews their plant to see if they have any of those systems and any of those phenomena. And there are certainly a number of technical issues that have been identified at a number of plants throughout this license renewal process. Buried piping systems was certainly an issue of concern. You had pipes that in many cases were buried and designed with insufficient water management, or other deficiencies, and experienced premature degradation to the point of significant leaks, and that in fact led to radiation releases on above allowed limits at a number of reactors in the United States. And as you know, these issues were identified and studied, it was clear that the original construction was not actually consistent with modern techniques and standards for buried piping systems and modern understandings of material degradation and optimal systems for maintaining moisture in some of these environments. So, these issues are typically identified because many of these are systems that are not accessible to inspection and in other early detection effects or methods. And so these are often identified when in fact you observe radiation leaks typically in groundwater or other areas. Concrete degradation is another issue where there have been aging related phenomena identified. One example involved a very interesting situation in which a plant was identified to have concrete degradation that was identified and determined to be a post or initial construction defect that was then identified after sufficient aging of the concrete structure, the concrete containment, and that led then to repairs that needed to be dealt with. Another issue, again, related to underground systems is cable submergence, and there have been instances in nuclear reactors where cabling systems that were submerged were degraded, and again, as a result of the aging phenomenon. So, none of these issues were identified through necessarily inspection and observation, but ultimately through failures of the systems in play. And so what happens is in the license renewal program, as these issues are identified, they're put into this GAL report, and then subsequent license renewal applicants must look at these issues and determine if any of them apply to their facilities. So essentially, when we look at this, what this really means is that this is a missed opportunity to really improve and enhance the safety of nuclear reactors in the United States. There are significant advancements in materials, electronics, and safety that simply are not addressed by the license renewal process. It's really just about identifying these programs, identifying the systems that must be subjected to the aging management programs, which are not all the systems in the reactor. And it is not an attempt to modernize or update the licenses or the licensing basis or the safety basis for any of the reactors. So, a good example of a missed opportunity in this process is really the digital instrumentation and control systems in U.S. nuclear reactors. So today, it continues to be the case that most reactors, the safety systems are old analog digital instrumentation and control systems. And while they certainly are robust in many ways, many of these systems are outdated. They are suffering from obsolescence. The original manufacturer, the components no longer exist, and parts are often manufactured individually to replace systems in existing reactors. And they don't take advantage of certainly the advantages of modern digital instrumentation and control systems. So while this has been something that's happened on the non-safety side of reactors in the US, the safety systems have largely not been updated to these digital instrumentation and control systems. And clearly, license renewal would have been a time to require and force these kinds of updates if a plant were being licensed to modern standards through more of a de novo review of plants licensing at the time of license renewal. So this is certainly an obvious example of, I think, a missed opportunity to enhance the safety of reactors through a license renewal program that focused more directly on looking at the actual licensing basis and modern licensing basis for a plant. Another example of a missed opportunity are the security enhancements that were made following 9/11. So plants in the U.S. primarily in enhanced safety and security for terrorist type events through additional ways to provide cooling and power to vital safety systems in the event of what are referred to as large fires and explosions, which of course one can imagine the source for those. It was, however, not required that plants, for instance, would be updated to deal with aircraft impacts. Newly designed reactors in the United States, however, are required to deal with large aircraft impacts. So here you have a significant difference between the existing fleet of reactors and the 2 reactors under construction in Georgia. Again, this is something that would have been an obvious requirement that for a newly licensed or a new review of a license for a reactor would have been something that would have been easily required to be consistent with modern concepts for reactor safety. And so again, this is another missed opportunity in the license renewal process. So that, as I said, has largely been the case for this first round of reactor renewals, and it shows some weaknesses in the process and some missed opportunities and some limitations. Now, one can imagine that that is the case certainly for the first license renewal, but the second license renewal, one would think that it's not going to be the case. However, I'm going to show that, in fact, that is really exactly the same process that is followed for a second license renewal. And again, part of the reason for that is that without license extensions, the nuclear fleet in the US will decrease over the next 10 to 20 years to the point where now, by essentially 2050, there would no longer be any reactors in operation in the United States. And so in the mid-2010s, when I was chairing the NRC, the general feeling among the staff was that there was a need to have updates to the regulations and more of a focus on the safety of systems that really were expected then to begin to see significant aging impacts as you go from 40 to 60 years of operation. Pressure vessel embrittlement was a big issue, and of course the large concrete structures, containment structures, and their ability to continue to perform their function. So again, we looked at some of these challenges with the initial license renewal approach, and while one can certainly argue that when you're looking at going maybe from 40 to 60 years, there's not as much of a risk significance to that additional extension because there was perhaps margin in these reactors to begin with, and that can get you some of that additional license operation. And in fact, when most of the plants were licensed, as I said, relicensed, as I said, they really only had about 20 years of operating experience to show what kind of aging impacts would appear. And plants could come in after basically 20 years of operations and seek that extension. So it wasn't necessarily obvious that there were a lot of aging impacts at the time that this initial program was embarked upon. Today, that's simply not the case, and we know now certainly that there are many aging phenomena that have occurred in U.S. nuclear reactors that are significant challenges to safe operation, and this is going to continue to be a significant issue. And the one thing that we can certainly say is that we do not and have not identified what all of those issues are at the outset. So there will be issues that occur and that are discovered. And the only way we will do that is through operation and essentially the experimentation with these reactors. So certainly this 60 plus years of operation is significantly more risk significant than the initial effort. And so in 2014, the staff of the NRC proposed updating these license renewal regulations to try to address some of this expected new risk significance in the second round of license extensions. One area where the staff proposed some changes was to reduce the time in which plants could submit their licenses. So again, if you think about this 20-year period, a plant that is seeking a second license extension can do that as early as 20 years from the termination of their license, which means that's right when they would begin operating under the first 20-year license extension period. So there's almost no operating experience about aging effects or other challenges to plant operation on which to build a sound foundation for a second license renewal. So the staff proposed shortening that period so that plants would have to have at least some operating experience and certainly some experience with the aging management programs. A second change that the staff wanted was to not allow plants to operate in this so-called timely renewal without putting in place new aging management programs for this extended period of operation. One of the other things that they wanted to include were reforms from the post-Fukushima and the post-9/11 security updates, that those should be included in the aging management programs as well to ensure that those effects were included. Now, the NRC ultimately decided not to actually implement a lot of post-Fukushima reforms, so that was not as significant. The other issue that seems perhaps obvious is that these degradation management programs, which form the basis of this aging management program, must be maintained and reported. However, they're not currently included in the operating programs for nuclear reactor licenses. So in fact, as you go into a subsequent license renewal, there's actually no requirements currently that these degradation management programs are monitored and inspected and enforced the same way as the operating programs for a nuclear reactor would have been at the time of initial licensing. So these were some obvious changes in the process that would have ensured greater safety. And in fact, the commission rejected making any of these changes. And so essentially, the subsequent license renewal program proceeds exactly the same as the initial license renewal program, with no acknowledgement that in fact 60 years is significantly more risk sensitive, with significantly more likelihood of aging phenomena and aging effects compared to this initial license period. So what is the net effect? Well, there are in fact now two reactors which have received, two sites which have received license renewals in the United States. Those renewals were completed in less than 2 years. And again, they largely followed the same process for the existing reactors. And as you can see of those two plants, those applications came in about 15 to 16 years before the expected termination of that first 20-year license. So within about 4 to 5 years of the 20-year, post-20-year license period, and they were awarded their license extension 13 to 14 years before that actual period of 60 plus years of operation will start. So there simply is no understanding of what kind of aging phenomenon will be relevant at the time in which these plants begin their 60 plus years of operation. Yet the licensees were expected to identify these programs. And of course, we know that that's very, very difficult to do. And so again, the focus is really on allowing the plants to operate more than it is on ensuring safety. There are currently 11 more applications under review or expected in the next several years. And industry surveys show that about half of the existing plants will potentially seek a subsequent license renewal. What I find surprising about that fact is that about half of the plants today are not indicating that they plan to do that. So there are many plants that probably will not seek a subsequent license renewal in the United States. Now, one thing I will note is that license renewal, it does not require operation. It certainly allows plants to operate. But as we've seen with the first round of license extensions, almost all plants were given an initial license extension, but many plants have actually shut down prematurely and never completed their license, their allowed license period of operation. So just in closing, oops, I think I'm a little bit over and I apologize. License renewal in the United States is really a pro forma step designed primarily to ensure the continued operation of nuclear reactors. The approach relies on the integrity of the existing oversight programs for inspections and oversight to maintain safety. It does not require new safety standards for any plants. And this is really a missed opportunity, I think, to upgrade plants to modern standards using, for instance, more effective systems like digital instrumentation and controls and better understanding of post-accident and severe accident phenomena. And effectively, some subsequent license renewals have an even weaker safety basis than the initial round of license renewals, because of course the process is basically the same, yet the aging impacts will only get worse as time goes on. So I will stop there, and I apologize that it went a few minutes long, and look forward to any questions that we'll have a little bit later in the Q&A session. Thank you.